Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Um, you might be able to tell that I've got a little bit of congestion going on. I have COVID. I did it, you guys, finally. I genuinely had convinced myself that I was going to get through this whole thing without getting it. I've had so many close calls, but this time was the big wiener. I actually got it. I debated actually doing this recording, sounding the way I do. But I got to be honest, I have been wanting to record for like weeks, and life has just really been getting in my way. And I've decided to just sally forth in the hope that the content will overshadow the unappealing aesthetic of this whole husky voice I got rocking right now. Hopefully, I'm not like completely turning you off, and it's a little more of a Phoebe Buffet, sexy cold voice. That's reach, but yeah, I don't know. I'm doing it. That's what's happening. I'm doing it anyway. So this series of episodes is going to be about cults. Now, why? Why the heck am I thinking about cults? I'm going to tell you, cool it, settle down. Just, cults have been a fascination of mine for a really, 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 really long time. I don't know why, honestly. I mean, I kind of have an inkling now, but in my life and even now, don't have a full understanding of my need to understand this weird thing that happens with humans, because I don't think that it is just a fringe thing. I think it shows us something about what's going on within us at sort of a basic level. And the first thing to sort of state out loud is that I don't intend to or want to discuss cults in a fetishistic way. Like, I don't want to be like, ooh, look how creepy and weird they are. Like, let's just, roll around in that for a while. That's not really what I'm after here. I mean, again, the truth is that I am now and have always been fascinated by extremes of human behavior. And cult practices are, to me, fall very much into that like anomalous zone that it's clearly tapping into something that is central, that is common, that is universal. And yet it only happens in like this, in cults like that we understand them in terms of like modern times. They exist in this very again, sort of fringe, anomalous way. And yet I think that again there are sort of signifiers in that are common in those cults that are also common in like basic precepts of human behaviors. And I think, right now that there are intersections of cult psychology in many of the pillar areas of American society, notably adjacencies to governance. So it feels to me like a relevant exercise to evaluate those intersections critically, to understand what they signify and what the potential repercussions may be. And, are there signposts along the way where there may be a kind of collective intervention to sort of avoid those polarities from finding their way into political discourse at the level that we're seeing now. I expect the answer to those questions is nah, like it kind of is what it is. But I feel like it's chicken soup. Like, it doesn't hurt to ask and to look for solutions that aren't, just shouting at each other. And so, looking forward, what I'd like to sort of do is build a case, kind of, that the psychology that informs cult behavior is present in our current political discourse, especially. And I'll begin with an overview, obviously, kind of a historical review of cults, a modern understanding of cults, and sort of the general psychology of cults. I will then go into a more specific discussion about the intersections of that psychology and the influences of cults, sort of more generally in various social areas. And then finally, talk a little bit about the idea of deprogramming and what is that path forward? Like, what are solutions that may harness some of those psychological traits in a more constructive way? And that is what you can look forward to. So I hope that you will hang out and enjoy the husky voice for a minute. And yeah, that'll be great. So see ya in a minute. Hang out. Okay, so let's begin with some kind of basic definitions. What is a cult? I once heard a religious studies professor say that cult plus time equals religion. And while I think that that's an objectively funny nerd joke, like every good joke, there's a kernel of truth there. Cults have been around for the length of documented civilization. However, I think that for the purposes of this discussion, it's more important to define sort of our modern day understanding of cults in a separate zone and then extrapolate how this, the distilled examples of cults shed a kind of light on tribal behavior as a, fundamental feature in society's epistemological processes. And there are typically three main characteristics of cults in our current day understanding, and I'll review those momentarily. But again, the idea of cults or religious sects, have been around for a long, 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 long time, and there's an infinite variety of them across the globe. And they usually revolve around a messiah or a prophet. So, again, sort of going into the defining characteristics of modern day cults, there are reflections. Cult examples throughout history tend to bleed over into society and religion and politics in more overt ways, where our modern day society has, in American culture in particular, there's a very strong division between church and state. And so those kinds of, bleed overs in American history have not been really, really strong. But I think we're seeing a move back towards that. And there have been moments, right? And I'll talk about that, where, religion inserts itself into political dialogue. That's not uncommon, but it's not common necessarily for religious precepts to sort of like wind their way into policy. And again, now we're beginning to see some of those things, and they're driven by again, these very sort of common characteristics that we're seeing in, that you can see reflected very clearly in cult behavior. So again, our current day understanding of cults, there are sort of three main characteristics. The first being a charismatic leader. Some examples of this are in history, in modern history, Reverend Sun Myung Moon of the Moonies and I think it was the Unitarian Church or Universal Church. I can't remember what they were, but everybody sort of knows them to be the Moonies. Jim Jones, that was an incredibly sad story where this Reverend Jim Jones began a church, got a lot of followers, kind of, transplanted them to this land in Guyana, and then eventually ended up murdering a congressperson and then committing suicide/murder of over 900 people, including dozens of children. And it was incredibly sad. David Koresh of the Branch Davidians, another example of a kind of, charismatic leader. Charles Manson, who everybody knows. Keith Raniere of the NXIVM cult, which is a very recent example. L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology, which I will talk about a little bit more because that one is sort of a special example, in my opinion. A second common feature of cults is the use of coercive tactics to break down individual identity and to isolate members within the cult and recruit new members. So they're very focused on creating a singular kind of unified identity, that the individual needs are sort of suppressed in the interest of the collective group, and in particular for the advancement of the leader. And it's the leader having kind of an answer, right, to the problems that you're experiencing. This leader kind of has the panacea, and so you give everything to this leader in spirit, in the 3D, right, in physical. You give all your assets, right? Maybe you bring your whole family into this group. You give everything of yourself for the advancement of this leader. And then a third common characteristic is exploitation of members for the leader's benefit. Again, mostly financial, but also sexually, and abuse and basic labor exploitation in many cases. But the common feature there is that the members give to the leader. The leader gives nothing, but the grace of his presence, I guess. But the common feature is that the members are essentially brought in, isolated from the outside world, programmed into an understanding of the threat of the outside world, and that this group and the leader are really the only answer that they can look to. And then the total stripping, like the strip mining of those members to advance whatever needs the leader has, be they financial or sexual or otherwise. So those are, kind of main characteristics, and they're generic in some ways. They but in aggregate, they do, I think, point us to, some pretty obvious examples where those definitions are clearly met. Again, the Moonies, Jim Jones, Ernst Davidians, right? Like those are pretty obvious examples of like cult mentalities. These people are dying, right? I mean, they're literally killing themselves for their leader. And then again, you sort of see reflections in society with religious extremism that very much has, cult like qualities. Again, that adjacency, like that religious studies professor said, like cults and religions are, kind of a Venn diagram, in a way. And they, they overlap in significant ways. And cult psychology is interesting in its effectiveness precisely because it relies upon very basic cognitive functions and psychological needs for safety, emotional security, and acceptance. The constant fluidity of social values demonstrates our tendencies towards tribal thinking. There have been a ton of examples, not that are, cult related, but that are just, society's manifestations of a given set of beliefs. And, we look back at them in retrospect and we're like, oh my God, what were we thinking, right? Slavery being an excellent example. Japanese internment, really immigrant persecution in general, witch trials, right? We've done these things, and kind of many of us have been like, yeah, that's the way it ought to be. And you look back at that and you're like, no, that's horrible. How could we have been so awful? And a lot of it is because of a set of beliefs, deeply held beliefs, not false agendas necessarily, but deeply held personal beliefs that are manifesting themselves in powerful ways. And we tend to, as societies, we tend to self-police on values through, shaming. Shaming has always been a successful tool in policing societal behaviors up until pretty recently, where it seems like shamelessness is just the name of the game now. But, again, when the values, right, that a collective set of society members have and hold and manifest in their societal interactions, when those values conflict with an individual's personhood, it creates marginalization. And marginalization itself begets isolation. And isolation makes us vulnerable to pretty much any acceptance that we can acquire. And, people who have come from a background of privilege, and when I say privilege, I mean that in like the broadest sense of the term privilege. And privilege, I think, in American society resides largely with white citizens. And so the marginalization as a white person, whether it's through, sexuality, if you're on, the LGBTQ plus spectrum, or whether it's through some sort of a mental health disorder, whether, like autism, or, even like Tourette's, which is a kind of disorder that, people are really off put by because of the manner in which it influences people's communication. But there are these marginalized, people who would not otherwise be marginalized, and that isolation is really strongly felt, versus, say, the African American community, who, and this is not to dismiss the power of the marginalization, because holy cats, we've just asserted that power in almost every facet of our society, which is so problematic. But I digress. There at least is a collective community that can share that experience, and it's a much broader community, and it's a much more diverse community. So there's a broader set of voices that can influence how that community now manifests its individual needs, right, as a collective. And so it's much more powerful. Whereas if you're a person sort of coming from privilege, and you're, forced into, an isolationist set, it's really frightening, and it can feel like the end of the world. And those people may cast about for just about any voice that affirms their worldview, and it makes them extremely vulnerable to cult type thinking. One of the things that happens when people find themselves in that, isolation, is that when they come across cult intersections, one of the first things that happens is love bombing. And that is a practice of giving acceptance and a place to belong for a person who has otherwise felt alone and alienated from the people around them. And it is extremely powerful when that is authentically felt, and those people can and do sacrifice a great deal to hold on to that feeling and feel like they found a place for themselves. And so they're going to fight like hell to keep it. I think isolation in general as humans reminds us how tiny and unimportant we are. And it scares the shit out of us. It's one of the reasons we're always looking for ways to explain the things that we don't understand, gods, aliens, whatever. We're always looking for reasons that weird shit is happening, or things that we don't understand are happening. And so we will create a metaphysical reality that aligns with that too. And I think religion, from what I can see throughout history, is a big part of that practice. But religion is, a more beneficent presence, I think, on balance. It has its problems too. All human endeavors do. But it's certainly not as destructive, nor as broadly and universally abusive as cults may be. So there are these common threads across, cults or cult-like activities. And again, I think all of those things mirror a lot of what we see in society kind of at large, right? Like, not necessarily drilled down into specific sectors, but, in our current moment, there's some really interesting organizations, activisms, and harnessing of new tools to really kind of hammer at the psychology and influence people's thinking. And I think it can be really dangerous. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about, kind of dive a little more into our modern day understanding of cults with some more kind of specific examples. And you can, I think, through that journey, see sort of the evolution that gets us where we are, and why it looks to me like there's sort of been this parallel track of like cults in society and how they're evolving. And now there's this weird kind of like crossover place where the two paths converge. So I'm going to talk about that next. Please stay and listen. Okay, so let's look at cults sort of through the lens of our modern day understanding, and on like a short arc of evolution. Now I'm gonna begin the timeline in the 60s and the 70s, because most of the stuff like prior to that was very weird and like incidental stuff that really didn't capture a lot like massive membership, like spiritualist movements. There were a lot of cults, around ghosts and seances and mediums and things like that in like the 20s and the 30s. In fact, there's a really great story about Harry Houdini, who was so like incensed by the charlatanism that he like tried to like infiltrate seances and like expose. It was really funny. Yeah. Anyway, check that out. It was hilarious. I think there's a Drunk History that did it, that did a version of it that is highly worth watching. So Google that if you get a chance. So again, I begin in our timeline in the 60s and the 70s. And that moment in time was tumultuous. Civil rights, the war in Vietnam, the assassination of a whole lot of leaders, including a president, a candidate for president, and many civil rights activists. And cults had a big moment in the 60s and the 70s in the cloak of religious movements or spiritualist movements, not in the sense of like spiritualism like ghosts, but spiritual movements in the sense of like, a connection with God or some kind of a, divinity through community, capitalizing on disaffected youth and increasingly anti-establishment people. There was a lot of, college students looking at socialism and looking at like Eastern philosophies and exploring the world in different ways, kind of just as a resistance, or a reaction to the post-war era where, there was a really heavy nationalism and sense of patriotism. And there's a lot of baggage that goes along with that. And the youths in the 60s and the 70s really kind of, were over that. And many of them gravitated to, swamis and gurus. Those were the cult leaders of the day in the 60s and 70s. And there were a whole bunch of them. A lot of Eastern Asian, Indian, Nepalese, people who put themselves up as religious leaders, and Westerners really kind of flocked to them. The Beatles at one point got involved with a guru. So yeah, they were big in the culture and gained some acceptance among the youth. And so there were some movements that capitalized on, social justice movements that, really kind of like spoke to youth culture. Jim Jones was one of them. He had a lot of really positive things to say about social justice in the early 70s during a time when shit was real bad. The civil rights movement had made a lot of progress, and the cultural backlash from that was very much, in its motions. And Jim Jones, pounced on that and, did things like created, he invited, homeless people to join from all over the country. Like they got on a bus and went to where he was at the time in the United States. And, he welcomed them with open arms and gave them a place to live and gave them a lifeline. And he accumulated these people, and then he transplanted them to Guyana, and then what happened after that, and it was very, very bad. Charles Manson was another cult leader at this time, because if you recall, Manson isn't serving time for murder. He didn't kill anyone with his own hands, but he did collect a whole bunch of disaffected youth, exploit them, abuse them sexually, and manipulate their minds he kind of attached himself to the vulnerability. He was, at the time, handsome, considered to be handsome. He had a rugged, hippie look about him and was very appealing to a certain, type of girl, I guess, or boy. And, he brought those people onto this creepy ranch in California and created a very isolated group dynamic there. And then he sent them out to, really just wreak havoc, like, commit chaos, acts of chaos. He had no point other than that. I think it was just the thrill of being able to do it, frankly. But that shit happened. Like, that was a real thing that happened. So, it wasn't necessarily just a one-off. Unfortunately, I think we tend to look at Charles Manson occasionally through the lens of a serial killer. And I think that's problematic because, again, he didn't kill anybody. He was a cult leader, and he was a malicious son of a bitch. And, he was a really broken person who had been, molded into a sociopathic monster from the moment he was born, and channeled that into the, manipulation and abuse of dozens of young people and coerced them into committing horrible acts. So sad. So, moving into the 80s and the 90s, the cult movements take a different turn, and they look a lot more like religious extremism, particularly through Christianity. They, I think, are capitalizing through a flavor of Christian religious extremism that was happening almost as a counterculture reaction. And the movements that rose, had a lot of adjacencies to right-wing evangelical movements. Some in ideology and others financially, but most philosophically, and again kind of appealed to the sensibilities of Christian people who, didn't feel that their churches were delivering, what they needed in terms of support and community. And they found these other places that felt truer. They felt like a higher purpose. They felt transcendent. If you listen to David Koresh speak, you can understand the appeal. He definitely had like a prophet vibe. He was very smart and he was very charismatic, and he spoke about scripture in ways that really connected with people who felt disaffected by religious movements and the kind of establishment religion that was, well, waspy, I guess. It was almost religion in name only. It had more of a cultural sensibility than a religious sensibility. And so a lot of people were like, that's, not, the kind of religious experience that I want. And they found their ways into the clutches of people like David Koresh. Another example is the Children of God, which PS is still active, but if you want to look that up, prepare to be disgusted. It's a horrible cult that capitalized on people's commitment to Christianity and then used it to really abuse women and children in awful ways and justify it through scripture. It's really gross. And again, still active. And then not so much Christian, but again, a kind of adjacency to religion, the Heaven's Gate cult. They committed suicide in alignment with the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet, believing that they would be transcended to and sort of escorted by alien custodians in a way to like the next level of existence. And here's hoping that happened for them. I doubt it, and it was really, really sad. But again, that the man who led that cult, I want to say his name was Marshall something. I can't remember. His name won't stick to my brain, and I didn't write it down. But you know who I'm talking about, I expect. And he was just a really likable nerd. If you watch him talk, he's very calm and measured and intellectual, and he has lots of reference, and his arguments are well formed, and he's very comforting and welcoming and warm. And again, you can, even though his thinking is just batshit cuckoo bananas, the formulation of his argument combined with his presence and his way of articulating ideas in a very like generic and accessible way, it's easy to see how people could, when they're in desperate straits, feel like here's a place I can belong. Here's a place where people get me. Now I'm going to slot Scientology in here as well, though Scientology is, again, it's kind of a special case. And it also spans all of this period because Scientology was begun by L. Ron Hubbard in the 60s. But it sort of languished away in weirdness until around the 80s when it really started to pick up some traction. And the 80s, it was a very 80s kind of cult in its moment. And it was asserting itself as a religious organization and was very, very, very aggressive about fighting with the IRS to achieve tax exempt status, which it did basically through a campaign of, well-funded legal harassment of specific IRS agents. Like, holy shimoly, those guys are just terrifying. And so again, for me, Scientology is sort of special, and it, because it claims to be a religion, but it doesn't really seem to offer any religious precepts. it's really just, it's kind of a, it feels like a multi-level marketing campaign. And then once you've paid enough money, then you get access to the real Fruit Loop stuff where they start talking about thetans and the aliens that, are attached to us, and that they, the only way you can, you, you've seen it, I'm sure. If not, if there's a billion movies out there right now. Also, the Leah Remini series on Netflix, Scientology: The Aftermath. It's a really good series. It's a really good. I thought it was a really, 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 really well done series, and I respect her mission. She's very passionate about it, and I think she's right in her. What's the word I'm looking for? Passion, I guess. I don't know. So moving into the 2000s to the present, cult behavior becomes very weird. And in part because the religious right movement has lost much of its overt political power. So those kinds of, evangelical church movements, Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, Jim Baker, they've fallen out of fashion, and not in no small part because many of them were like indicted on fraud charges and stuff like that. So I'm sure that didn't, infuse people with confidence in religious institutions. And then on the Catholicism side, there's been a lot of really bad press about the Catholic Church for many decades now, relating to how they interact with their community, and in particular children in their community, in the not awesome ways that they have managed that process from the church leadership. And there's a lot of cynicism that has emerged in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And cult movements at that point begin to, or continue to assert a greater focus on capitalizing on that increasing isolation that's driven by the emergence of internet culture, information manipulation, and consumer culture. So it becomes this sort of just grab bag of like choose your own adventure with the internet, and people increasingly feel alone, and they are reaching out and trying to find communities, and there are communities there, and some of them are up to no good. So an example of that is Nixium. Again, kind of a multi-level marketing campaign situation at first. It's like, accessing your potential, kind of a lot of self-help stuff. But it drew people in a way that was like total friggin' commitment. And again, total isolation from sort of outside communities. And they developed into an organization that sexually enslaved and trafficked women. Gross. So that guy's doing a lot of jail time right now, Keith Raniere, thank goodness, because that's awful. But that happened. And it happened a lot because people felt like they needed a purpose, right? Like they needed a place. And the world is, it's easy to feel alone when you can hear everybody's voice. QAnon. I've talked about QAnon before, and I will talk about QAnon extensively here. QAnon is a really good example of the internet's answer to cults, because I still think it began as kind of a joke. I think it was kind of a cynical way of proving that you can get people to go along with any crazy shit, as well as being a vehicle for asserting a very specific political and worldview. I think it was a combination of things. I think it got bigger than anyone expected it to. I think because its genericness, its general ambiguity, the mystery of it, the cryptic quality of the Q drops and stuff, it gave people lots of space to breathe their own oxygen into the process, and kind of build their own idea of what the movement has become. And I find it particularly interesting that QAnon has gotten such a hold in the religious right community. And again, Scientology, here they are again, right? In the 2000s, we learn that Scientology has been doing things like imprisoning members and beating them, and that the David Miscavige, who's the chairman, is just a horrible, abusive, violent man, and that they just continue to steal money from their members and then commit really horrible atrocities when people are like ready to go from this abusive system. Then they destroy their lives. If a person leaves the church, and again, they're families that have grown up in this church, right? So let's suppose you're a mom and you're married and you've got 4 kids and all of them are in the church and your husband is in the church, and then you realize that, like, this is really bad. They're doing really bad things. They're lying. None of the things that they're telling us that they've done in the world in terms of like treating addiction or battling poverty, like all of the things that they're saying we've done, they're not doing. And all of the money that they have is being spent on the lavish lifestyles of their leadership or on the legal activity to shut down people who are trying to expose what's going on. Like all that money that they don't have to pay taxes on is being used as a fund to be a legal bully. And they're awful. And it's definitely a cult because these people are completely isolated from the world and completely cut off from the world and are forced to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for books and classes and events, and are forced to do press if they're stars, or are forced to recruit other members. It's just a really bad organization. But I think it is a good example of a place where like they're not Christian. Like they're not about God in any defined sense, like any other, religion might be. There isn't necessarily a prophet per se, because they're not about, a religious experience. They're about kind of asserting intellectual power. They're about mind control and telekinesis, and like you're supposed to be able to, like, once you've cleared yourself of all of these like alien influences on your body, you're supposed to be able to like move things with your mind and like make money by just thinking about it, like like Tom Cruise. So they are very much a cult, and their influence on society, again, look at Tom Cruise, is gross and also really telling, right? Because one of the things that Scientology does very, very effectively is they tap into celebrity culture. And Americans are just really disgusting about celebrity culture. You know it. Don't try to deny it. Don't. Just no, shh. Don't deny it. You know it. I know it. Let's just be real with one another, right? Keep it 100. You're gross about celebrity culture. You love it. You can't stop. You try not to, but there you go. Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. What's going on? Blech, right? You hate yourself for doing it, but you can't stop. Scientology taps into that impulse very, very successfully. So cults are not just the Moonies, right? They don't have like a defined thing. They share common characteristics. But if you look at those characteristics and then look at other religious organizations, particularly ones that aren't necessarily centuries old, right? Like the Mormon Church is a good example of that. The Mormon Church's adjacencies to Christianity and the fact that it holds on to sort of fundamental tenets of Christianity, I think, carve it out, right, as a religious community that is more credible per se than something like Scientology. But even so, their beliefs rely heavily on the teachings of one individual leader. I want to say his name is Brigham Young, but I don't know. I don't know a lot about Mormonism, so forgive me if that's wrong. Anyway, one guy who got, these special tablets and special glasses so that he could read and translate the tablets, and then he carried forth that scripture to the people who became Mormons. So they really follow those tenets a little more closely than the central tenets of Christianity or Catholicism, and thereby take on like a slightly cultier kind of vibe. Also, they do significant tithing, but most religions do tithing, so that's not new. But the scale and the degree of their tithing, as I understand it, proportionately doesn't really align with other religions that well. So there are more like mainstream, like accepted religious movements that, may have cult characteristics, but, they themselves are not. You can leave the Mormon church, I think, with some difficulty, if I'm honest. But I think you can pretty much get out without, worrying that they're going to ruin you financially or, chase you around and call you squirrels or some shit. Scientologists are so weird. So those are kind of the features of cults that I think, really do lay out basic psychological needs. One of the places where religion functions in a really healthy way in our lives is it does create community. It does create around a shared set of beliefs, a sense of togetherness and a sense of support. So that is a very basic psychological need that every person seeks out, whether they want to or not. It's a basic, like automatic function. And isolation has really damaging effects on our psyche. So, in the next bit, I am going to talk a little bit more in depth about the psychology of cults. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those intersections of, various social frameworks and how those psychologies assert themselves in different examples. So I hope you'll join me. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a lot of fun talking about this piece. I've been thinking about this episode for a while. It was on my original list of like podcast ideas that I really want to talk about because I'm so fascinated by the mechanics of this and of, cults. This is one of those things that we think about in a way that's like, it doesn't really touch us, right? Like it's not going to affect us, but you don't know. Like no one is like, what, I'm going to join a cult. It happens organically, and it happens because of predatory behavior. And I want to talk a little bit more about that predatory behavior and our responses to it. And in the next bit, I hope you'll come back. If you want to reach me or contact me or have questions or comments, I hope you'll feel free to do so. You can reach me by email at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. And I hope I will see you there. And I hope I'll see you in the next part. Thanks. Until next time.